Luke Fickell is changing his attitude. And maybe that's the key to Wisconsin's season not falling apart this year. We got some injury updates to Billy Edwards Jr. and Jake Renfro, and some thoughts on the Wisconsin football offensive line coming out of Luke Fickell's press conference today. Breaking it all down here on Talkin Badgers. Oh, we caught me dancing. Oh, and we caught me zoomed in. All right. It's quite the day. If you're watching on Talkin Badgers, the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@TalkinBadgers. I am your host, Kedrick Stumbris. You can find me on the website formerly known as Twitter, all the various social medias at Kedrick Stumbris. Luke Fickell had his weekly press conference today as I continue trying to not laugh at myself here because you caught the a little piece of the little jig I do while the jingle is playing. Luke Fickell took to the podium in Madison today for his weekly press conference. And sometimes these are informative. Sometimes they're enlightening. Sometimes you're really going just to ask questions about injuries and get updates on players. Sometimes, you're trying to write a story about the opposing team and you want to know what the coach thinks of the opposing team. All kinds of things. It's a press conference. Sometimes they're just not helpful at all on occasion. But I thought today's for Luke Fickell was actually pretty illuminating. And when I pitched to Dylan the vision for the show, Dylan Graff, publisher, editor, entrepreneur extraordinaire of BadgerNotes.com, I mentioned, a regular weekly schedule for the show would look something like on Mondays or Tuesdays, we would talk about Luke Fickell's press conference on Mondays. And, we haven't done that really all that much yet, aside from just talking about specific injuries, because there hasn't been too much to talk about otherwise. But I thought today, Luke Fickell's presser was very illuminating. And that came thanks to some comments by him in the way that he started it and things that he continued to come back to throughout. So first, I want to start with the injury updates to Billy Edwards and Jake Renfro, because I'm sure that's what most of you are here for. Luke was asked about the injuries and said, I don't know with either of them. To Billy Edwards and Jake Renfro, of course, Renfro, who finished the game but suffered an apparent lower body injury in that game. We do have confirmation that's a lower body injury, and exactly what it is has me a little bit more concerned than coming out of that game, even still. Luke Fickell said that both Billy Edwards and Jake Renfro are going to have an opportunity to play this week. I don't know how far along we are in being able to determine that. It's Monday, so they're not sure. Billy Edwards, they said, is day to day. He went through warm-ups in Alabama, but ultimately didn't end up playing. They just don't know. They're going to continue monitoring the situation, and we'll find out what happens. Luke Fickell is far from ruling him out. He entertained a question about what it's like for players to play against their former teams. The question specifically centered around Billy Edwards and playing against Maryland, where he transferred from. So if it is completely out of the question that Billy Edwards plays this weekend, I think Wisconsin is doing a good job of keeping its poker face. We'll see. Jake Renfro is what I'm more concerned about. And part of that is because of the offensive line bit that we'll get to at the later half of the show as well. But Jake Renfro, Luke Fickell says he's got an ankle now. And last week it was the knee. Jake Renfro gets injured in the first half of that game against Alabama, taking a sack on that play. Emerson Mandel giving up that sack, getting just torched off the edge. And then Kerry Kudanko subs into that game. He immediately also gives up a sack, unable to pick up his defensive lineman on a stunt. Jake Renfro gets wrapped up underneath pretty bad, rolled up on the initial sack of that back-to-back sack sequence, and sits out for quite a long period of time, eventually comes back in after Ryan Corey ends up playing 10 snaps, who looked solid. And Luke Fickell agreed. Again, we'll get to that in a little bit. But the Jake Renfro injury, hearing that, was a knee, now it's an ankle, for a guy who missed 2 full seasons of football with various lower body ailments, that should be concerning for this football team moving forward. Fans of Wisconsin in the entirety of the Luke Fickell era, frankly, have seen firsthand just how bad things have been with any other player not named Jake Renfro snapping the ball for this offense. And yeah, there should be players who can snap the ball and play center effectively other than Jake Renfro, but that's just not what's happening right now in Madison. That's not. If Jake Renfro is going to continue to be in and out of the lineup, that presents real challenges. And it's obviously not anything new saying that, but the new piece of information that it is multiple lower body ailments now makes me think this is not something that is going to be resolved this week. This is probably something Jake Renfro is going to be playing through, probably something that offensive line coach AJ Blazik is going to be playing through, something offensive coordinator Jeff Grimes is going to be playing through, and determining on a week-to-week basis exactly what the personnel they have available to them. They simply won't know. I don't think at any point, at any week throughout the season. I think Jake Renfro is what will truly be week to week, as opposed to Billy Edwards, who was initially called week to week in that report by ESPN's Pete Thamel. But I think that was more so just, trying to put a little bit of spin on the ball and say they just don't know when he's going to be back yet, which was also part of that report. Again, complete guess, complete speculation. But from what it sounds like with Renfro, from what it seemed like we saw with him, I think it truly is week to week, and he's going to be a game time decision every week until we hear otherwise. And that is not speculative, because he was apparently a game time decision before Middle Tennessee, and he was clearly a game time decision as he was listed as questionable ahead of the game against Alabama. They need him in there. They need him in there because of the challenges that Wisconsin has had on the offensive line. And that's what I want to talk about next. The young guys. Luke Fickell was asked about the young guys. And Ryan Corey stepping in at center, Colin Cubberley playing right guard, Emerson Mandela at right tackle. All three redshirt freshmen from the anchor point on that line all the way over to the right side. Luke Fickell asked to assess their performance today from the tape that he would have watched from Saturday. And he put it pretty plainly that this is not a game, football. Football is not a game meant for redshirt freshmen on the offensive or defensive line. What a lot of offensive linemen are is just not college ready. That's what Luke Fickell said. How big they are, how strong are they? And that doesn't just mean in the weight room. He's talking about some of the just intangibles, not necessarily intangibles, but just skill things that you have to be able to do as an offensive lineman. Fickell ended by saying, the truth of it is, that's where the grown men stuff really shows. Even if all of these young guys are physically talented, they just have so much more room to go. They have so much further to go in their development because they are redshirt freshmen. They're playing really, really young guys on that unit. And that's tough, really tough, not just against Tuscaloosa or in Tuscaloosa, but really tough in basically any environment, any college football game. I thought Emerson Mandel was kind of a perfect example of this, where right now, footwork at right tackle, and maybe some of it is sheer lateral quickness. I'm not sure. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I'm not sure. Footwork wise, he looked bad at right tackle on some snaps in particular, just getting beat pretty poorly. I thought he played pretty well against Middle Tennessee, had some standout moments, but I think his best standout moments were just when he was asked to push guys over rather than really handle quick guys off the edge. And he does not appear at this point in time ready to handle quick guys off the edge. Perhaps he is better suited to play inside. And that's something that I know that I said on this program I was not certain of either, because some of the more technical aspects of playing inside, he struggled with those. against Miami. That was where he struggled the most. It was not in his physical capability. It was some of the more technical aspects. It was the problem of he and Renfro pulling into each other on blocks. But if that's something that can be more easily cleaned up, right? Something where Luke Fickell said today, the real growth in players just throughout the season is in all those young guys. You expect the young guys to grow more throughout the season than your veterans do, because the veterans have done most of their growing, right? If he can grow there, he's going to have a better season overall compared to the difficulties that might present themselves if right tackle is just something he's not physically capable of handling right now. Granted, I don't know that this debate matters all that much because I think the line kind of is what it is. I think your preferred starting five throughout the rest of the season is going to be from left to right: Riley, Mullen, Brunner, Renfro, Coverly, Mandel. And you roll with Ryan Corey at backup center. That being a guy that, like I mentioned earlier, Luke Fickell really did rave about. There are times where, a coach just speaks about a guy and is complimentary. Luke Fickell was asked about Ryan Corey in the presser, and his face kind of lit up in a way that you don't see all that often. And maybe it's, he's a guy who's played on the line. And so he has a bigger respect for those guys. But his face, Luke Fickell's face, really lit up when talking about Ryan Corey, saying he played 10 plays. He did a good job. He played aggressive. He played fast. He said this a couple of times. He said he played fast. And there were other instances in which Luke Fickell mentioned that when you have young guys in there, the game is just really fast. And that can be really challenging. He also mentioned, and this makes some sense, given that they played Corey Kadonko for one snap. Clearly, they thought he was the better option initially. But Fickell said after watching Corey on Saturday, he said Corey still has a lot of learning to be had, but maybe there was something that he showed that we didn't even know about. I think they were really impressed with him on Saturday. They were really impressed with Ryan Corey on Saturday. And frankly, I understand why. I thought in the 10 snaps he played, he showed himself to have exceptional poise in a situation in which he was absolutely thrown to the fire. I mean, there is not a situation in which you are thrown into a hotter, bigger fire than playing on the road at a probably top 5-ish Alabama team. So I think Ryan Corey was pretty impressive. On the run game, Luke Fickell mentioned, this was a place where obviously Wisconsin has struggled. And he puts a lot of it on the offensive line, is what's very clear. So if we are assessing, the offensive line as not being solid enough on the interior to really help these running backs and get them going, as I believe we've talked about on this program, it seems that the staff is assessing it in the same way, at least based off of Luke Fickell's comments. He does mention first that the ability to get the run game going, you need to lighten up the box a little bit for guys, and they need to push the ball downfield in order to make the running game more effective. And some of their inability to pass the ball deep comes down to protection. I think that's obviously true. But he did mention that it all comes down to those guys just working in unison, was what Luke Fickell said. And for a line that has had all kinds of shakeups over the last 3 weeks, there just have not been a lot of opportunities for those guys to play in unison. They're going to have to play together more often. And having Jake Renfro in and out of the lineup certainly doesn't help that, but that's just where you're at right now. Luke Fickell also mentioned that he thought there was some yardage out there on Saturday that we didn't take advantage of. He went on to mention that we motion in the offense. It's sometimes not the easiest thing to line up to. And that's where you see the youth. That's where you see that there are going to be times in which the offense lines up and you're expecting linemen in front of you lined up, with a certain alignment alongside you at 3 tech or on the 4 eye outside. And maybe everything's just a little bit out of place. Meanwhile, the veterans are just like, okay, well, I know when we run this play, there's going to be a guy in front of me and my job's to block him. Meanwhile, when the game is moving so fast and everything's just not quite exactly what you may have repped in practice during the week, that can throw the young guys off a little bit more. And so the young guys and the challenges out there, right? It all compounds throughout. Compounds to just not everything's just quite as aligned as maybe they've seen it before. The veteran guys have just seen more and can adapt relatively quickly and don't have to think as much as these redshirt freshmen that make up 3/5 of your offensive line right now. They just need to rep it more. They need to rep it more and more and more. And that's the only way it's going to get better. As Luke Fickell said, it really comes down to those guys just working in unison. The only way you can be working in unison is if you've worked with each other. And Fickell did mention and talk about the running backs, saying that he thinks the running backs understand what this process looks like, what this journey looks like. Obviously, the running backs have not had, this is my words, the kind of opportunities that they have wanted or maybe expected would be there for them so far this year. And Luke Fickell did say that he wants to see more from them. I want them to get greater opportunities. Luke Fickell also mentioned that he still thinks the running backs are the most competitive group on the team. There's going to be a lot of chances for those running backs to get some run in Big Ten play, at least if, Wisconsin isn't embracing the opportunity to come from behind too often. And this really is something that needs to get fixed on the offense, is you need to find a way to get these young guys to gel together, to get things going in the right direction, because right now Wisconsin's averaging 3.8 yards per carry. That projects out as Wisconsin's worst mark through an entire season, their worst mark in a decade. Coming off of, as we've said on the show before, off of one of their worst seasons running the ball in a decade a year ago. And there is some, they just played Alabama in that data, three games, 3 data points to get to 3.8 yards per carry. And you just played the Alabama Crimson Tide as one of them. That's baked in there. But Wisconsin also rushed for only 3.8 yards per carry against Miami. It's not like they ran the ball great against the Miami Redhawks, not the Miami Hurricanes. They didn't run the ball great against the Miami Redhawks either, 3.8 yards per carry. The only reason it's sitting at that same 3.8 yards mark, because they only rushed for 2.7 yards per carry against Alabama, is because they rushed for nearly 5. I think it was 4.9 against Middle Tennessee. And a lot of that coming outside the tackles. A lot of that coming on designed QB runs. A lot of that coming on designed wide receiver runs. This team has not found a way to run the ball with its running backs between the tackles so far this season, and that's going to hinder this offense's ability to do what it needs to do and score points to win football games. It's something that needs to be fixed. It's something that I think Luke Fickell, when he was asked just kind of these bigger picture questions about the offense, he kind of kept bringing it back to the offensive line. And again, I don't know if that's just from he was a guy who played in the trenches when he played. And so maybe that's just instinctively where he looks first. That's an internal bias he has. That could be very true. It could just be the case that that's where ultimately they see the nexus of all the issues stemming from, and it all waterfalls down from there. And I think that's what a lot of us who have appeared on this podcast in recent days, weeks, have thought. Okay, I want to talk about Luke Fickell and his positivity that he is embracing, because this is going to close the show. And I think it is a really stark change from what we saw from Luke Fickell to close the 2024 season. For better or for worse, I think Luke Fickell is trying to learn lessons. And this is, we are getting all the way away from like talking ball. We are talking culture. We are talking fourth phase. Shout out to Ryan B. Eilers. And maybe it matters. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it matters long term. Maybe it matters short term. Maybe it doesn't matter. Right. Who knows? It's got to matter some, right? Somewhere in there. But I thought watching Luke Fickell's postgame press conference against Alabama, when he said that he was, trying to remain positive. The tone felt very different from what we had seen from him in the past, when quite literally the last interaction we had with Luke Fickell at the end of the 2024 season was him literally banging his fist against a table, talking about that's the opposite of complimentary football that you will ever see, his exact words, to open the press conference when Wisconsin lost to Minnesota to close the season. Something that's pretty hard to forget when you were there. But he seemed to strike a different tone and say in that post-game presser on Saturday that he told the guys in the locker room, frankly, that's just a really good football team, and they're on a different level right now. In the presser this morning, he started with the longest opening statement of a in-season press conference that I think I can remember from him. And this long statement about the opportunities in front of them. And this is, the start of the real season, were his words. And they got a mountain to climb, his favorite phrase. And this is where it all kind of starts. And they need to embrace the process. It just feels very different from the attitude he had, which just felt more, I don't want to say angry, but maybe angsty. And I know that's, I know that's splitting hairs, but I'm trying to give him a little bit of credit. Angsty over miscues, penalties, things like that. And there were a lot of them against Alabama. We talked about that in the instant reaction show. I thought that was where Wisconsin looked the worst on Saturday. It wasn't necessarily how Alabama forced them to play. I thought Wisconsin, Wisconsin did a lot to help themselves lose that game. And Luke Fickell in this presser today just really acknowledged that, yeah, we could bag on the mistakes. We could bag on some of the bad plays, but they have to find ways to stay positive and keep moving forward. He said one thing that really stuck out to me during the presser today on Monday was before the fourth quarter of last week's game. Fickell said, I kept reminding the team that the season is a journey, and every snap, every play is a process for us to get better, no matter what the scoreboard reads right now. He later went on to say, they just need to keep finding a way to get better. And that really stuck out to me because I think we've heard a lot about just this being a results-oriented business. And as Dylan Graff has said on this program before, I think he said that something along the lines of coming to Wisconsin has really humbled him were Dylan's words. And that this just hasn't worked as quickly as he thought it was. And I think Fickell is having to take a different tact to this program because of it. And I think he's starting to show that. I'm really glad that Jim Polzin of the Wisconsin State Journal asked a question about this today. He asked if this kind of positivity, Fickell said that he was trying to remain positive in that post-game presser against Alabama, and Fickell showed that same kind of positivity today. Jim Polzin asked if this was something intentional from Fickell. And Fickell basically said he could get mad, he could pound his fist, his words, his words. But Fickell just said he doesn't know what good that does. And he doesn't want to live and die by what happens on Saturdays. I think if Dylan is right in some of the other conversations we've had with him on the show, and Dylan, I know you're probably listening. You probably feel like you're here because I've quoted you like 6 times in this episode, and we're going to hit it one more time before we get you out. If Dylan is right, that Luke Fickell is something of an emotional coach, something that I think he said in the post-game reaction show against Middle Tennessee, where Luke Fickell maybe was frustrated with the performance during the first half and just wanted to take the 3 timeouts and a minute of clock back to the locker room. Save those timeouts for this past week against Alabama, where he didn't use those 3 timeouts in the first half either. Stockpiling, rolling over. But if it's true that Luke Fickell, and I feel kind of bad for bagging on him in the middle of a sentence where I am trying to give Luke Fickell credit. If it's true that Fickell's kind of an emotional guy, he's understanding that maybe he needs to take a different tact. And I think he deserves some credit for that. Whether it leads to results in the field or not, he is trying something different. And that process, I think, is important. He's trying to keep his locker room bought in. He's trying to keep the team even-handed. Something that we know they didn't do last year, because we heard from a ton of guys at preseason media day that there were guys who they felt quit on the team. We heard from guys after the Penn State loss that they thought it was really gut. They thought that it took them, 2 weeks to get over blowing that game against Penn State. And then they went out and got crushed against Iowa, perhaps as a result, because they let themselves lose twice. And I think maybe this tact at positivity is how Luke Fickell is trying to do something different than what he did last year in how that loss rolled over from a game like Penn State, rolled over into a loss to Iowa, and kept rolling over until the end of the season. Luke Fickell said in kind of closing his answer about this, being intentionally positive, he said that he wants to ask his teams to have the competitive maturity to not just accept a loss, but to move on from a loss. And Luke Fickell also said that that is not something he's personally ever done a good job. Kind of leaning into, Dylan's hypothesis that this is a guy who wears his heart on his sleeve a little bit. So Fickell said, I challenge myself that when those things come up, to be able to do what I'm asking the leadership of my entire team to do, just not just accept a loss, but to move on. I think that's maybe what we're seeing. I think this game against Alabama, this first loss of the season, is maybe this first time we are seeing a different psychological approach to his locker room from Luke Fickell that, for better or for worse, he needs, right? Whether it's a good thing that he needs to be doing something different, whether it's a good thing or whether it's a bad thing that his locker room was not responding to the way he was doing it in years prior, right? He is trying to make an adjustment there. And I do really think Luke Fickell deserves credit for that, regardless of how this goes forward from here. I think that. I really believe that. It's been something that was brought up to me by at least one other person, was saying, just seemed like Luke Fickell seems a little different. And I tend to agree. And I think that's what he would say he is trying to be. We're going to be back tomorrow with some Talkin Badgers. We're going to hit you with some After Dark, some Seamus Says this week. Also trying to get Gardner Fickell on the show, Wisconsin Badgers analytics extraordinaire this upcoming week. All kinds of folks who aren't just me coming on and blathering. But this has been Talkin Badgers, your daily Wisconsin Badgers podcast, powered by BadgerNotes.com. You can find the show, youtube.com/@TalkinBadgers, on the internets, x.com/TalkinBadgers. You can find me, your host, Kedrick Stumbris, on the website formerly known as Twitter, @Kedrick Stumbris. Until we talk to you all again tomorrow on Wisconsin.